Prepare to qualify.
I guess I had some people asking about the whole droop deal on these cars, and obviously, just to start with, the rear is very important to have correct droop, because now instead of having the T-bar to control the droop somewhat, now it's 100% on the shock. And before, a lot of times, what I would do is, if anything, internally space, underneath the piston. Like sometimes use an O-ring or a spacer, but a lot of times an O-ring would work fine to control the droop on the car. Which is basically how much, when you lift up the back, how much the pod falls back down. Now, obviously, the really good article on the Tamiya USA website details that in photographs and words, and it's fairly obvious if you look at what's going on. But I thought I'd just add a couple things in terms of a practical standpoint on that. And by that I mean, on this car, I've got, you can actually, this is an old touring car droop block set, but you can kind of use this as well. Let's see if I can pop this wheel off real fast. This is right. Don't know. But anyway, try to get the wheel off so you can see better what I'm talking about here, because you can use a droop gauge like that. I think this is the correct one. Sure is. Knock the wheel off and show you what I'm talking about. You can use a regular droop set, and this one, you can see it actually goes from 10 down to 0 and then -3. So a nice thing about that is you can tell whether it's level, -2, -3. In this case, if you want to measure the droop here, it's about probably 1.5. It's not resting on the 2 when I go to the back of the pod. That's one way to do it. You can also just use a regular gauge. And in this case, we'll kind of slide the tire back on. You can also measure, okay, here's our regular under the chassis setting, which is at right about 5. And then you can lift up. Now we see it's about 1.5, 6.5 on here, so 1.5 difference. So the two sets of measuring tools agree. So that's two ways to do that. And then just on like I said, on a practical scale, right now inside of this shock I have 4mm solid spacers. And basically what you can do is set the shock to have the absolute minimum amount of droop you would have on the car, which would typically be 0. That's the absolute minimum. and then you can actually take your, pop your shock end off, and increase the length of the shock by rolling the shock end off and unscrewing it. And the nice part about that is you can quickly ascertain about where you need to be on your droop. And the good thing, once you've done that, you can kind of either, if you want to go back and internally space the shock, that's fine, or you can just leave it the way it is. But I just find that it's a pain in the butt to space the shock. So if you can have it where you know what range of droop you're going to use, you typically should be able to get a couple 2 millimeters out of the shock in terms of unscrewing the end, and then you can adjust it easily and not have to redo your shocks every time you want to change a droop on your car. Which on this car, you're definitely going to have to keep an eye on it, because it's definitely even more important than it was on the T-bar cars. So like right now it's 1.5. 1.5 was pretty good at the track I just went to. It's a big outside track, leisure hours, and that was good. I really didn't have to change it around too much. Now the front end. First off, to make my life easier in terms of tuning this car in, you may be able to see I've drilled 2 1/8 or about 3 millimeter holes, one right above each droop screw. I don't know if you can really see too much. Here's the hole, droop screw's right under it. That way, when you're working on the car on the fly, you can just go right in with your driver, and let's say the car's, which is the situation I had, the car's working decent, but I'd like to have a little more stability getting on the throttle. I wanted to get a little more weight transfer to the back of the car, a little more lift up. I just cracked each screw a quarter turn from what I had initially. Same thing, quarter turn, added that small amount of droop, and the car was a little better getting on power because of what the weight transfer back. Same thing, you want to take away a little bit of that rear stability, and you'd like to have the car steer more on power. Same thing, go right back in there, quarter turn, let's say, back in, or excuse me, back out to take some droop out. I think right now, and again we use the same sort of method as what we did before to determine the droop, but you should go with checking both sides of the car if you don't use spacers in here. I wasn't using spacers in here underneath the screw. You can't really see probably incredibly well, but there's no spacer, it's just a screw. So I'm setting them side by side. In other words, right here we have about 5 millimeters ride height. Lift the car. Right now it's probably sitting just about perfectly 1.5 droop. Same thing, we'll check the other side. And we'll lift. And it's about 1.5 droop on both sides. Probably, and my initial adjustment on this car was 1 millimeter for the front end. So that quarter turn on the droop screws let the car now have another 0.5 millimeter of droop. So it now lifts up an additional 0.5 millimeter before the tires start coming off. So again, just half turn in. We got or excuse me, quarter turn in on both sides. We got like 0.5 millimeter or more droop. I don't, you know what, it probably would be hard to measure the droop via blocks like this. I suppose that if you knew your two settings on the, you could maybe measure the axle or something, I don't know, but the easiest way to me seems to be just going with the regular ride height gauge underneath and then lifting the car. What you could do though, actually, to ensure both sides are the same, if you really wanted to, is take the wheel off and measure the axle heights. It isn't necessarily a straight translation of the droop of the car, but what it would be good for, let's say you wanted to rebuild your car and you knew, you had XYZ setting. Now, actually in this case it may be easier to do this without any blocks. It will be easier to do without the blocks. Let's say you had one of these gauges and you knew your car was, the setting was good. Okay, and basically we're talking about, video got kind of cut off here. Just talking about a way to ensure you have the same droop setting on the car. One thing you can do if you liked how your car worked and you want to reproduce that, let's say you're going to rebuild the car, work on the car, instead of just going underneath the regular droop gauge, you can use one of these droop gauge that comes with the blocks and kind of do a similar thing where you run that under the axle and same thing both sides. And then note what it is. In this case, it's about 2.5 on this side. Same thing over here, about 2.5. It's sitting. So, if you like to do it like that, you can also do it that way. You feel that's more accurate. You want to check the exact axle height or whatever, you can do that as well. So that's two ways to do it. And just in general, same thing. Front end droop. Basically more front end droop equals more weight transferring to the back of the car. And less front end droop, you're going to keep more weight on the front of the car. What that translates into more on power steering with less droop. Your car's going to steer more on power. More off power steering with, or I shouldn't say, more on power rear traction with more droop, because the weight basically is going to the back of the car, versus instead of, you get this effect, in other words, the weight goes back. If you only get this much, you're not going to get as much weight transferred to the back of the car. So that's pretty much that as far as the droop goes. The same thing, you want to keep, the nice part about using this thing is you can kind of make sure things are the same side to side. If you don't want to use the spacers on the droop screw, which are going to ensure that they're the same side to side, but you also lose maybe a little flexibility to change the car on the fly if you're trying to tune it at the track. So that's the downfall there. But again, if you use the same droop all the time, then that's cool too. You can just set up the spacers, boom, you're done. And with the rear, same thing. More droop on the rear is going to let the car have a little more rear traction. It also is going to let the car transfer more weight to the front on an off-power steering basis. Because the car can kind of unload and sort of the weight comes forward. less droop, obviously. Same thing is you're not gonna get as much steering off power. It also may make the car a little sketchier too, especially if their track's kind of bumpy. If you know some parking lot tracks, you also have to allow the car to be able to not only drop into divots or bumps or whatever, but also, when the car gets on the throttle, basically what happens is, there goes some bearings. I should put the screws back on the wheels. Basically, when the car gets on power, if you hold the wheel down, essentially the motor wants to, if you look at the spur, the way that the motor turns, it wants to climb up on the spurt here. And if you look, I guess maybe this is a better way to illustrate this. If you hold the wheel down and move the motor in a way of rotation, you can see the car picks itself up in the center at the pivot point. You can see the wing move. So what's happening is, as the car accelerates, it wants to do this stuff. So a certain amount of droop is also helpful, just to let the car rise and have some rear traction. That's not a huge deal, but just to illustrate kind of what I'm talking about. Sometimes you have to have a little bit of droop here, and that's the thing too, is that what's funny about this is that I've known for a long time the droop screws are on the car. I knew what they were for, and I honestly never really used them, which is probably a mistake on my part, because I can think of at least one race where, had I went and used the droop screws to the effect that they should have, I probably would have done a lot better, because my car just felt completely stuck in the track and had too much traction. And taking the droop screws and taking some of the droop out of the front end would have helped to keep a little more front traction on the car. And this is carpet on foams, but I think, especially something like that, where you're in a real high traction situation, it's a good idea to pay attention to what your droop screws are doing, because probably at that point the car was just lifting up and it was just stuck into the track. And before mostly what I would do is actually use preload, if anything. On this preload, the springs that kind of have a similar effect, but it's not the same. It's really not the same thing at all, but it's kind of does sort of some of the same things, but not really. And yeah, looking back at it, I can see I made a mistake there for sure. It's just that I never really even fooled with it, and it just wasn't on my radar. And having played with it a little bit now, I can see that it's a hugely important adjustment. So keep that in mind. But yeah, so that's kind of the droop deal.